Welcome back, everybody. On Tuesday, Chris gave us an absolutely wonderful introduction to the Lycians and who they were, where they came from, and even solved one of those endless mysteries, who were the sea people? Well, touched on it. Tonight, Chris has promised us a visual feast of all the places that relate to the Lycians on his Turquoise Coast tour, which will be going in 2026. So thank you, Chris. I'm looking forward to this enormously.
Thank you, Julia, for this warm introduction. Welcome, everybody, to part two. And this is a little lighter in terms of the content tonight than the deep dive into who the Lucan people were in the Bronze Age and how they evolved into the Lycian people of the Iron and Classical Ages. Just to remind you, this is the region of Asia Minor or Anatolia that we will be visiting on this tour. So just to give you a locus to have in mind. And this was a map I showed the other night as well. These are the four ancient peoples that we cover on this tour. We start over here in Pamphylia. We make a little jaunt up into Pisidia to visit a site. Then we spend most of our time in ancient Lycia, Caria, and then out here onto the two islands, which were part of Caria in the ancient world, but they're part of the Dodecanese Islands. So we'll be visiting Kos and Rhodes. And just very quickly, we talked about the Lycian culture from its predecessors, the Lucans, and its emergence around 1100 to 1000 BCE. And I left you all right around the time of 480 BC when the Greek alliance had defeated the Achaemenid Persians, and Lycia at that point had become independent, and then it was subjugated again, and then it had some alliances, and then it was free again, and then it was subjugated again. It was a pretty busy time after 480 for the Lycians. We're not going to continue with a historical approach tonight. I want to pick up with Alexander the Great. I was really struggling to try and figure out a way to have a theme for this second part, which I really wanted to be a visual tour of some of the sites, especially those related to Lycia. And I really was trying to figure out how can we do this. And I was reminded of two of my absolute favorite historical figures. One, of course, is Alexander the Great. And then there was Freya Stark, one of the most amazing women of the early 20th century. She was born at the end of the 19th century, but she wrote over 24 books and traveled at a time when it was rare for any Westerner to go to places like Arabia or Iran or deep into parts of the world that just were not open to Christian Westerners, let alone women. And so we have a number of women who did this. Some of you I know are familiar with Lady Jane Digby. Others, of course, have heard of Gertrude Bell, but Freya Stark was amongst the top ones. So I want to put a plug in here for anyone who may have traveled with me on this tour in 2023 or 2011. If you've not read these travel logs that Freya Stark wrote, The Lycian Shore and Alexander's Path, highly recommend that you explore them. And if you're not in the mood to read the actual travelogues themselves, but are interested in biographies, this biography on the right by Jane Fletcher Janice, A Passionate Nomad, is a just page turner. So I'm going to take a page from the life of Freya Stark, who in these two books on the Lycian Shore and Alexander's Path went in the 1940s and 50s and followed the path of Alexander's forces as they crossed from Asia Minor into Mesopotamia and beyond. So we're going to follow in the footsteps of Alexander tonight. And so just to refresh for those who may not know, this is the extent of Alexander the Great's empire upon his death in 323 BC. He died in Babylon only 10 years after he began the conquest. Unfortunately, he did not live very long. We are only going to be interested tonight in this little section of his empire here. Once he crossed from the European continent into Asia Minor, he landed at Troy first and then made his way down through many of the sites that you're familiar with on the Aegean coast of West Asia, sites like Ephesus and Priene and Pergamum, these sort of places. And it's when he arrives down here at Halicarnassus is where we're going to begin tonight. Now, just for the record, we are going to be going in reverse of what we do on this tour. On this tour, we start over here in Antalya and we work our way back to Halicarnassus and then out to the islands of Kos and Rhodes. But Alexander went the opposite direction since he was coming from Macedonia, north of Greece. So we're going to pick up tonight at Halicarnassus. And I'm sure many of you have seen busts of Alexander. There's thousands of them. Here's one of my favorites from the British Museum. And I love to include this detail from the mosaic in the House of the Faun in Pompeii, which is a very famous mosaic of the final battle between Alexander the Great and the Achaemenid Persians. And here we just have a quick image of that mosaic. It's really quite stellar. And here's Alexander right here against Darius the Third, the head of the Achaemenid Persians right there. And this was the battle, of course, where Alexander defeated the Persians. All right, so we're going to start in Caria and work our way back through Lycia and into Pamphylia and up into Pisidia. He arrives with his forces in Halicarnassus around September 334 BCE. He finds an extremely well defended city with these gigantic walls that were 6.5 kilometers of high walls that encircled the city. And the walls were as high as 11 meters in places, and the towers were even higher. It was very important that Alexander take control of Halicarnassus because it was at this point in 330s the Achaemenid Persians had once again taken control of pretty much all of Asia Minor, and he had to defeat the Persian navy. The Greeks at this point, especially the Macedonian Greeks, did not have any navy to speak of. So it was really important if he was going to advance, and that all took place here at Halicarnassus, modern Bodrum in modern Turkey. This is what you see today when you approach Bodrum from the sea. This is not the fortress from the time of the 4th century BC, but we do actually have traces of those walls. If you were to climb across these hillsides, you would still find remnants of the wall that encircled the city that he had to besiege. And during this month of September, in the year 334, they launched a full-scale siege of the city. At this point, it was under the control of the Persians. There was a royal family before the Persians had taken control, one of whom you will learn a bit about in just a few moments, a very famous king, if you will, although they didn't really use that term. But here we have a nice little drawing on the left showing the gigantic siege towers that Alexander and the Macedonians built in order to attack these walls. On the right-hand side is just a fragment. It's the only remaining fragment of one of these wall towers. It's part of the Mindos Gate, and it's just outside modern Halicarnassus to the west. And it is preserved here on the right-hand side. They estimate to just over half of the tower's original height. So I don't have anything here to show you scale, but we're probably looking at about 10 meters, maybe 8 meters on this highest point. And a little fun fact is, I don't know how many of you might know this, but it was actually the Greeks who invented catapults, the stone throwing catapults. And that was in 440 BC. The tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily, a man by the name of Dionysius the Elder, who was inspired by crossbows that were coming into fashion at the time. And he built the first of these non-torsion catapults. They're more like ballistas, where there would be like a bow that would be pulled back and then eject something. But 100 years later, Polyidus, who was the engineer for Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, he was the first to invent the torsion catapult. And I have a photo here to show you. I just bring it as an interesting fact from history because it was these catapults, these torsion catapults, that allowed the Macedonians to destroy those colossal walls of Halicarnassus and take the city. Now, once they were in Halicarnassus, they would have seen the most famous monument that was there in antiquity, the Mausoleum of Mausolus, which had been built between 353 and 351. So just 20 years earlier was the arrival of Alexander the Great to the city of Halicarnassus. That former king of Caria, Mausolus, this monument was built for his tomb, and it was inspired by his contact with the Lycians to the east. And this mausoleum, which stood very tall, but it was emulating these tower tombs that had been in use by the Lycians to the east for several hundred years at this point. In fact, Mausolus, just 7 years before he started building this tomb, which he actually died before it was finished, and his wife, Artemisia, actually completed it for him. But he had annexed Lycia 7 years before this tomb had been begun. Now, today, we don't get to see this marvelous monument because it was destroyed in a series of earthquakes and then mined as a quarry for building material by many different peoples in many different time periods. So you just don't get to see this today when you're there. But do note up here the the quadriga chariot that surmounted the top of it. When you visit the site of the mausoleum today, this unfortunately is what we see. We get to see the footprint of the monument, and we see a lot of the architectural elements. And there's a very interesting little museum that is on the site with some very good graphics. So you really do get a sense of the monument in the space. On the right-hand side, I've just included a photograph of one of the monuments that is in the British Museum, and it is one of the horses from that four-horse chariot that had been at the top of the monument. There are very few of the decorative elements, architectural elements, are left on the site or even in Turkey. Many of the most important ones were carried off and are still in the British Museum, like this horse on the right-hand side. But Alexander would have seen this monument when he took over the city in 334. Once the Carian capital city of Halicarnassus was under his control, he headed east to another of the Carian cities, and this was Kaunos. And you can see that Halicarnassus is way over here, Bodrum is right there, and we're talking about traveling all along the coast here. There was a few other sites along the way that he visited, but the next major site is here at Kaunos. Interestingly enough, we don't have confirmed recording that he visited the site of Kaunos, but it seems very likely that he would have, given its importance as a port at the time for Caria, and also for the Lycians before Caria had annexed the region. On the lower part here, you can just get a sense of how large. Here is this area that you visit today, down here where the theater is and the various temples and the series of terraces that lead down to the ancient harbor on this side. And this side overlooks another larger bay, but less useful harbor on the northern side there. Like I said, we don't have textual evidence that he visited the site, but it seems very, very unlikely that he would not have visited Kaunos. And today, this is what we see when we visit Kaunos. A few examples here. You can see that the city was built way up here on one of these promontories, and then down the other side opposite from us in this photo on a series of terraces. There's a lot of reconstruction has been done, so we get to see a lot of various monuments, such as this Heroun, a small dedicatory temple area for whichever heroes were particularly relevant to the city of Kaunos at the time. And on the right-hand side, just a larger image of one of the theaters. You're going to see a lot of theaters. There's a lot of theaters in this part of modern Turkey. From Kaunos, he would then have had to cross the Dalyan River, and he would have entered Lycia, what had been the original boundary of between Caria and Lycia by doing so. And we saw some images of these tombs that I showed the other day, because the upper ones, these very decorated rock cut tomb facades, and we talked a bit about how they're similar to the ones in the Nabateans in Petra. These are the Lycian style tombs. But down below this, we didn't talk about this on Tuesday, but you'll see these sort of tombs down here. And there are literally thousands of them at this site. Many of them are actually dug into the tops of formations rather than sides like the ones we were seeing here in the photograph. These are Carian style tombs, where they're not decorated on the outside or the inside. They're really just simple rock cut chambers with sometimes loculi or spaces carved in the interior walls where the bodies would be laid. Sometimes they're just carved benches that the bodies would be laid upon, which is the same in these facade tombs up above. But I wanted to bring it up here because I didn't actually mention that at this site outside of Kaunos on the Dalyan River, everyone goes there and we hear about the Lycian tombs, but in fact, there's a lot of Carian tombs there as well. So when he left Halicarnassus, we know that he moved along here and very likely visited Kaunos. But we do know for fact that he visited Termessos, which is modern Phthia. Right here's where the river comes in at Dalyan, and Phthia is right about here. So we don't visit Telmessos in any great depth on this tour, so I'm not going to cover it very much. So I've used the opportunity here to include one of the 19th century drawings that you can find for a lot of these sites. I've not included them for any of the other sites, but here at Telmessos, this one by a man named A.R. Grieve is just really spectacular. And these were very common in the 19th century for people who were traveling. They would buy these books that people would publish in order to see the sites before they traveled. And if they couldn't travel, they would buy these books in order to see what the world outside looked like. And many of you are familiar with the painter David Roberts, who did this all throughout Egypt and West Asia. And did some of the most famous paintings from the 19th century in Petra. So I just wanted to include that here. So at this point, we've gone from Halicarnassus to Telmessos and Kaunos. And then we know that the next major site that Alexander's forces went to was Xanthos. And Xanthos, if you recall from the other night, was the capital of the Lycian kingdom territory for quite a long time. And at this point, it was debated for a long time whether Alexander actually conquered Xanthos or if they simply capitulated. It's now pretty much accepted that it was capitulation. I mean, that is in fact what our ancient sources tell us. But there was some indication that there was destruction event that happened around this time in some of the excavations, and people began to question whether or not there had been a battle. But as far as we know, the Xanthians just said to Alexander, "We're tired of our Persian overlords. Sure, we'll align with you." And so here are a couple of the monuments you can see when we visit Xanthos. There's this stunning theater with these views. If you're sitting in the seats of the theater, you'd be looking back out over this mountain range that loops around the city. It's really quite a beautiful setting. And then, of course, we have another one of these Lycian tower tombs that's you can see at Xanthos. There's a lot of these tower tombs at this site, but I've included this one here again because I think it really gives a good sense of that parallel between the houses of the living and the houses of the dead, where you can see these stone emulated wooden pillars that would have supported the roof in a wooden house. So really quite intriguing. This, of course, is where some looter in the past broke into the tomb, and most of them have been broken. Actually, all of them have been broken into. Everyone that I've ever seen. Then he went on just south of Xanthos is the city of Patara. And Patara is very important in the history of the region. For of the time of the Lycian kingdom, it was the main port for the city of Xanthos and the other Lycian cities that were upriver of the Xanthos River. We talked about that the other night as well, where some of the center of the Lucan, the predecessors of the Lycian, the center of the Lucan culture was along this river. So it has a very long history. But Patara itself is important in the case of Alexander the Great because they were the port city for Xanthos. They capitulated immediately and went over to the side of the Macedonian Greeks. And I'm going to jump ahead for just a moment away from the Alexander story because the other important thing about Patara is it was the center of the Lycian League. Now, we mentioned briefly on Tuesday that the Lycian League was a confederation of 23 city-states that formed in 205 BC. So that's 100 plus years after the death of Alexander the Great. But it was the first democratic union in Western history that was based on proportional representation. And Patara was a huge city. And so it had three representatives in the league, and it was one of only four cities that had that many representatives. And it was, again, based on the population, it was proportional. So groundbreaking. And the Lycian League would be a major factor in the formation of the United States Constitution in the 18th century. All of those founding fathers of the United States were classically educated, as most people were who had any education in that part of the 18th century. They have been familiar with the story of the Lycian League, and it is said to have been a significant inspiration in the formation of the American democracy. From Patara, he then would have proceeded to Phaselis. Now, they're not exactly close together, so it would have taken a couple of months to actually move his army from Xanthos Patara to Caria. And in fact, he had to split the army in order to move it. So some of them went inland and others went a little more close to the coast. And in both cases, there really were no roads. And so there was a group of Thracians that he had brought with him who constructed bespoke roads as they were moving the army across Asia Minor. So he gains control of Phaselis and its three harbors by December 334, according to one of his generals, Arrian. Here we're seeing some examples of the Roman period aqueduct that is still standing on the site. Here, of course, is another theater, which is very well preserved. It's up on the hillside overlooking where the downtown areas of Phaselis would have been. And here included a photo where you can see part of some of the structures that would have flanked one of the three harbors here. The theater's off here to the left of this big tall tree up on the hill. And this is the main colonnaded street of the town off in the background there. So we've now gotten to Phaselis. So to show you on the map again, Patara and Xanthos are here. Phaselis is here. And so it's really on opposite sides of the Teke Peninsula. And the line on this map shows that the army went both ways. Alexander and a smaller portion of the troops from Xanthos went to Phaselis, but part of the troops went overland and picked up a trail that went up the mountains because he wanted them to get to Gordium up here on the plateau. But once he left Xanthos, they made their way to Phaselis, and Phaselis, as I just said, capitulated. There wasn't much of a struggle involved in taking that town. Some of the representatives from Phaselis had actually gone to Xanthos when Xanthos, the capital, had capitulated. But there was a little bit of resistance still at Phaselis, but nothing significant. Now he was in a bind because he needed to get to this area here, which is where modern Antalya is. Antalya did not exist at the time, but his goal was the city of Perge. Now, again, there was no road at this point. So he sent some of the troops, as I said, about more than half of his army, on a road that the Thracians were building for him through the mountains. So their armies like traveling as they're building the road. But he wanted to get there quicker. So he decided to go along the coast. Now, you might recall from Tuesday night's lecture, I showed some topography slides. There are no beaches between Phaselis and modern Antalya and Perga. The land actually comes fairly precipitously, almost in an unbroken wall down to the ocean along this stretch of the harbor. Antalya Harbor is one of the best harbors on the southern coast of Turkey. So the harbor is great, but this section, it would be hard to traverse along the coast. But he did it. And we're told by Arrian in Anabasis of Alexander that he left Phaselis and he took a select group of troops along the coast, which in the wintertime, generally the winds are blowing from the north. And that was the only reason that he was able to do this with his troops, because the winds coming off the north were able to push the water away from the shoreline, making it possible that even when there was no beach, the water would be maybe chest high, neck high, and he and his troops would either swim or walk through the water to get from Phaselis to Perga, or to this plain where Antalya sits now today. And Arrian even says, during some of their progress, the winds had begun to switch periodically, and there had been steady winds blowing from the south, southerlies. If that had been the case consistently, he would not have been able to do this because the water would have just been pushed right up against the precipitous cliffs that come down to the ocean. Now, people debated for a long time, I mean, centuries, millennia, did he actually do this, or is Arrian just giving us one of these almost tropes? I mean, Alexander was so great that he could traverse a section of the ocean that nobody else could. So in her travels in the 1950s, where Freya Stark was following in the footsteps of Alexander, she gets to Phaselis, which is right about here on the coast. And she says, let's test this. Now, this woman is in her 40s, 50s at this point, and she does it. She and a couple of traveling companions jump in the water and do a combination of swimming and walking and manage to make the 25 or so kilometer stretch between these two sites. So, and she writes about that in those two books I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. So Perga was the main goal for him at this part of Asia Minor. It was a very important city, had been for a very long time. not particularly politically important, but a major center for commerce. He shows up somewhere toward the end of December of 334, beginning of January 333, and Perga just opens the gates and says, "Welcome." Because again, they're sick of their Persian overlords at this point. So I've included a couple of the major features that one sees when you get to visit Perga today, one of which is this gigantic stadium, which is in extremely good preservation. And I've also included just this lovely image of one side of the colonnaded street where they have restored the columns correctly, I'm happy to point out. Once Perga has aligned themselves with the Macedonian Greeks, he then baffles around a bit and hits a number of the cities around Perga on the plain there of Antalya. One of these was Aspendos. And Aspendos decided to resist at first. Then they decided to capitulate. And he says to them, "Okay, I won't attack your city if you agree to give to me all of the taxes and tribute that you annually give to the Persians." And they say yes. And he goes off to another site called Side. But they then decide to renege on the agreement. So he comes back with his army and is set to attack the city of Aspendos. But instead, they capitulate, and this time he imposes much harsher terms. But they agree and ultimately stick to it. Now, one of the main feature that's still preserved at Aspendos is this theater that had been built in the Greek time and expanded in the Roman period when the Scaenaphons was built here, and this series of arched colonnades around the top. But it's incredibly well preserved. It had been used throughout all of the centuries, and then what damage had been sustained by the theater had been restored by the Seljuk Turks when they came in and took control of it and actually turned this part of the Scaenaphons into sort of a fortress. It was their main administrative office for the region. So it's managed to survive the millennia very, very well. So when you get there, it's very extraordinary experience to go in and walk around this theater because it is one of the most complete ancient theaters anywhere to be found in the world. Here's just an example I included of the bull-headed and wreath pattern, which is very common. And at some point, I will talk about, hoping to do a special lecture on some iconography of the region and the time period. And on the right, I've just included a small photo of a Seljuk period bridge, which is you can tell that very clearly from these pointed arches. And this one, which is slightly more rounded than pointed, is because of the voussoirs that came up here. It originally had been a Roman bridge and then collapsed and was in disrepair. So the Seljuks rebuilt it. And it's an extremely impressive. We do visit it on this tour, and it's a very, very impressive monument. Now we get to one of my absolute favorites, and this is Termessos. So this is a mountain city in Pamphylia. Now, Perga was in Pamphylia, as was Aspendos and Side were all Pamphylia. So when he left Phaselis and traveled to Perga, he had moved beyond Lycia into the territory of the Pamphylians. So Termessos was complicated in that it wasn't purely Pamphylian. It was actually its own sort of city that aligned with Pamphylia, but for the sake of argument, we'll lump it in with the Pamphylians for the moment. It is an entire city on top of a mountain, Mount Salamis, that is still like all there. It's largely collapsed, but it has not, the stones have not been carted off by subsequent peoples after the city fell out of use and then earthquakes and other events destroyed the buildings. It's all still largely there because it's on top of a mountain and a forest has grown up on it. And you can get a glimpse of that right here with part of the Roman period aqueduct that's still in situ and this marvelous doorway to the Artemis Temple that's still standing. Everything else around it of the temple has collapsed. And it's unclear from the sources whether this was restored at some point in the past. I don't believe it was. I believe it actually has survived from antiquity. But one of the most spectacular theaters anywhere in the Mediterranean world is it's not the best preserved, but it is literally built on the edge of this cliff at the top of the mountain. So here's the highest peak of Mount Salamis off here, off in the distance here. And the city is over here to our left, and which would be sort of the northwest portion of the mountain. And if you're sitting in these seats, you can just get this breathtaking view out over the valleys below the mountain. And I've just included one example of a rock cut tomb here to illustrate that the Pamphylians also used rock cut tombs. So we often hear people talk about the Lycian tombs, and we'll see even travel books and stuff call all of these rock cut tombs Lycian tombs. Well, they're not. The rock cut tombs are ubiquitous in the ancient world. What makes them a particular culture is the style of the tomb. And in the case of the Pamphylian tombs, they're not very dissimilar from the Lycian tombs, but there are some distinct differences in terms of the iconography that will often be carved up here in the tympanum above the doorway, or there's also inscription sometimes in the Pamphylian tombs and the Carian tombs, but not as frequently in the Lycian tombs. So again, variations in them, but I wanted to include it here to show that these are amongst all of these cultures, they all had rock cut tombs. Oh, I forgot the most important part about my Alexander story. Termessos is Alexander besieged the city because they refused to concede to his authority. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to be rid of the Persians, but they wanted to be independent. So he besieged the city. It is the only city in his entire campaign that succeeded in foisting him off. He could not take the city and ultimately left and went on to the city of Sagalassos in the neighboring province of Pisidia. And Sagalassos is another extraordinary city. In this case, there was a battle, but it wasn't a very significant battle. They mostly capitulated, as everybody did. Because remember, they had not seen these torsion catapults and other siege engines and siege mechanisms that the Macedonians were employing. They just had not been seen before. And word would spread very quickly, especially after the destruction of a lot of the walls at Halicarnassus, which were some of the biggest walls in the region at the time. People would be naturally afraid of the advancing Macedonians. So here in Sagalassos, which there was a wall, there's not much of it remaining today. They capitulated, and he was actually granted some great favors. There were some monuments built immediately in honor of Alexander here in Sagalassos. And it's another stunning city on a mountainside. It's built on a series of terraces. And at one of the highest points of the city is where the Agora and the public Nymphaeum it was built in the later period. This, of course, is Roman. It would not have been there at the time of Alexander. But a version of this Heroun, or special little temple to the hero cults, was there. The one that you see today again is a later rebuild, but we know that there was one there at the time of the 4th century BC. And I've included on the right-hand side, you don't see this on the site today. You see a replica of it, but this is a stunning little statue, or a life-size statue, rather, of Dionysus with a satyr that stood in one of these bays of the Nymphaeum. All of the originals of the statuary from this Nymphaeum are today in the Burdur Museum. One of the other fantastic monuments in Sagalassos is the library. And you can see here where there would have been niches, there would have been statues and other important symbolic items in these niches. And you can see some of the literary quotes along the upper part of the facade here. Part of it had collapsed, so these bricks would not have been seen in antiquity. It would have been covered with more marble or some other stone that was probably plastered and painted. But it's still nonetheless, you can't go inside because they're protecting this pebble mosaic that's on the floor here. And it has actually been posited this was inspired by the black and white pebble mosaics that came out of that or started in Macedonia. One of the first sites where we have mosaic work at all is around Vergina in Macedonia, and the Macedonian mosaics of the fourth century were simple black and white mosaics, as is this mosaic in the library here at Sagalassos. And then we also have this spectacular theater built in the Greek style on the hillside overlooking the city, which is down here. So now a quick side note on the Greek style theaters. When you tour with me on this, you'll hear this ad nauseum across this tour. Most of the theaters that we see in Asia Minor are all carved into the side of hills, and then built masonry is used when needed to shore up because the hill wasn't fully big enough in that particular spot. And then, of course, all of the seats and other features are constructed masonry. But we have to remember that the west coast of Asia Minor has been Greek for centuries at the time. I mean, for 4 centuries or more before Alexander and the Macedonian Greeks leave Macedonia and come to Asia Minor. Much of Asia Minor has already been Greek for a long time. So it's not like these theaters came in after Alexander brought Greekness or Hellenism to the region. It was already there. So this is the end of our little jaunt with Alexander. He leaves Sagalassos and he goes up through the mountains and he rejoins his army at Gordian. And this is, of course, where the famous story of the Gordian knot is. And everyone's like, how do you untie this knot? And Alexander whips out his sword and cuts it. So there you go. And I've included this lovely Baroque painting from Giovanni Paolo Panini depicting the event. And there's Alexander with his sword and the Gordian knot right there. So, and that ends the sort of thematic approach to seeing some of the sites that we visit on this tour. I want to quickly go through and show you some of the other sites that don't link directly into the Alexander theme, but have just some incredible features that we will visit on the tour. And I will also note that there are more than half a dozen other cities that we visit on this tour that aren't even being touched on in this lecture, because I'm noticing the time. I'm already over time and I'm not even finished yet. So we talked the other day about the Lycian tombs at Myra, and I'm just throwing up a couple of slides here again to show you the Lycian rock cut tombs at Myra. Myra was essentially the port city of Perga for much of its history. But the other thing that's in Myra that's a really fascinating historical value is it is the main home of Saint Nicholas, the original forefather of modern Saint Nick and Santa Claus. And so here's an example of Saint Nick in a modern civic statue. Here is an example of the frescoes that you see inside this church. This is a church that was begun in the 8th century, so it's late Byzantine, even almost early medieval, but at that point. But this is just one of the saints that's still well preserved on the wall. And the other thing that is really fascinating about this church is its use of opus sectili pavement. So rather than, there are some mosaics, but much of the church would have had this opus sectili work instead. And that is kind of more typical of the later Byzantine period than the mosaics of the earlier and middle Byzantine periods. We spend a few days in Antalya and we'll see lots of different things, but I'm going to only include here this lecture tonight, something from the Roman period, which is this beautiful gate through the walls that was built by Hadrian in the 2nd century CE. And jumping ahead to the 9th century, we have a string of mosques that are really fascinating in Antalya. One of my favorites is the Korkut Mosque here. It's known as the truncated minaret mosque because a series of destructions and fires damaged it, and the minaret would eventually be rebuilt, and it became this odd shape and truncated and shorter than other mosque minarets that we see at the time, even in Antalya itself. I showed the other night an image of the fluted mosque, which is the tallest one in Antalya. We also will visit the Antalya Archaeological Museum, which is just breathtaking with its antiquities. Many of the materials from these sites that we've talked about and some of the sites we haven't talked about have been brought to the Antalya or the Burdur museums in order to protect them. So this one in Antalya, this museum has an extraordinary collection. It has the best collection of the prehistory stuff, the Neolithic material that's been found in the region. And this is this lovely example of the Neolithic figurine here of one of the classic Neolithic fat ladies on the left. This wonderful statue with a broken nose, but it is a portrait statue that was more than life size. I believe they say it was about 1.5 life size. It is of the Emperor Lucius Verus from the later 2nd century CE, and this example of a sarcophagus fragment. You don't see a lot of the super decorated sarcophagi on the sites. They've all been carried off over the centuries and now are being gathered back into the museums for safekeeping. Because of course they're usually made of limestone or marble, which is a harder version of the limestone family. But they are susceptible to weathering, so leaving them outside is not good. This one is an example of this. This had been looted from Turkey and ended up in Germany and was brought back as part of a cooperative agreement between Germany and Turkey. And we see about a half a dozen such items in the Antalya Museum. Some of them are just spectacular. Then we leave from Halicarnassus, from Bodrum, and we go across to the island of Kos for a day visit on this trip where we will see the famous Asclepion, where the god Asclepion was worshipped, and the father of modern medicine, the Hipparchus, practiced under a tree that is said to still, a plane tree, is where he held his classes. And they say that the tree that's standing there today is actually a descendant of the tree under which he taught, but who knows if that's true or not. And I love this little photo of, we'll visit a Roman period villa that's been restored and turned into a museum. And this is just an example of one of the displays. And I hadn't included any pottery in tonight's lecture, so I've chosen this image of the ceramic jars in the Casa Romana on the island of Kos. And remember, this is one of the Dodecanese islands, and at the time was under the control of the Carians at Halicarnassus. And finally, we end this tour on Rhodes, and here's just a couple of examples of things that we'll see. In Rhodes itself, we'll see the Mandrake Harbor. We'll go to the World Heritage Site of Lindos and climb to the Acropolis. And then I also included a second image here from within Rhodes itself, because we'll spend a good amount of time visiting the Palace of the Grand Masters. And this is the main entrance. Now, the Grand Masters, I'm not going to talk about because I'm out of time, but this is, of course, the Knights of St. John of the Hospital of Jerusalem. And so it's part of the Crusader story. And we get to talk a lot about the Crusaders on the Turquoise Coast tour. And then one of the highlights of this tour that people really love is a lot of our transit. We leave Antalya and we head down around the Teke Peninsula part way. And then at one point we get on Goulettes and we traverse for 6 nights and days on the boats. We sleep on the boats, we eat on the boats, we do leisure on the boats, and we get off during the day and go visit sites, and then we come back and so forth. And we get to swim in the water. The boats are equipped with things like kayaks and paddle boards, and it's really just an incredibly relaxing experience. This is a very intensive tour. We cover a lot of rough terrain. We cover a lot of sites, and having this little really luxurious interlude of traveling by boat for the middle part of the tour was enjoyed. On the 2 previous times we've run this tour, it's been a highlight for pretty much everyone. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. And once again, I've taken the full hour, and for that, I apologize. I just don't know how to make these lectures shorter. Thank you very much. I will now open up for any questions that people might have.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. I was just wondering if you could explain what's behind you in the screen.
Okay, that's one of the sites that we'll visit. It actually is called, it's a site called Semena, and it's a Lycian town. There's an acropolis with those domed Lycian tombs that we can visit, but there's also a fortress that we climb up through this lovely town on a series of stairs to the top and look out over the Mediterranean Sea from up there. And we get to this by Goulet. We arrive by Goulet and we depart by Goulet. And along the way, we see part of two different sunken cities. So what you're seeing over my shoulder there is that ship that I think is just over my left shoulder. That is the Goulet from 2011 that we traveled on. And you'll see a couple of other Goulets in the background. But it is a stunning location to see and experience the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Chris.
No other questions?
So if there are no other questions, I will take the opportunity to say a big thank you to Chris for two wonderful lectures, Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.